Elisabeth, and today we're going to look at how to write imagery, symbolism, and metaphor in poetry. As we'll soon see, knowing how these aspects are interconnected will help to evolve our writing process so that we can create from a place that's not only authentic, but also ripe with purpose and meaning. So with this aim in mind, we're going to start off by briefly defining each of the respective poetic devices as well as how they relate to one another. We'll then examine the poem A Dream Within a Dream to observe these elements in practice layer by layer. Next, we'll go over some ideas on how to find material in our day-to-day life in order to write our own imagery, symbolism, and metaphor. And then finally, I'll actually go over an example of writing a poem using the process shared in this video. As always, there are timestamps provided in the description below. If you have any questions or need clarification on anything mentioned in this video, feel free to let me know. Imagery in poetry is any kind of descriptive language that engages our senses and evokes a mental image. In this case, the phrase mental image should be understood as the product of the mind when it constructs or reconstructs sensory details during the process of reading, introspection, or imagination. So all of the information that we perceive through our senses can be thought of as a kind of palette of imagery that we can use when we're writing our poetry. This imagery is constructed not only from the obvious senses of sight, smell, hearing, taste, and touch, but also from kinesthetic senses, which involves movement. Then there is also what is referred to as organic or abstract imagery, which includes bodily sensations or internal processes like pain or sickness, hunger, as well as our emotions. While imagery used in prose is primarily descriptive or mood setting, that shouldn't be the case in poetry. When imagery is used in poetry, it should be used for more than just creating the mood for the poem to inhabit. Each sensory detail needs to connect in some way to the poem's theme. If we focus too much on creating a certain kind of mood without investing time into earnestly connecting to the subject matter, it becomes obvious to the reader that we aren't really writing from an honest place. This results in contrived work and is without a deeper exploration of images and their meaning. It's similar to the situation when art students are asked to draw a realistic still life portrait. In the final render, we're able to tell if their portraits were drawn from photographs or a live sitting. There are qualities that are flattened to the eye in the photograph, sensory decisions that have already been made because of the restraints of the photograph. The sensory compression will inevitably dilute the way the artist perceives their subject. On the other hand, when the artist draws from life, they have a boundless amount of sensory details that they must either choose to ignore or use in the final render. So drawing from a copy may be easier, but drawing from life is more rewarding. And this is exactly how we should think when we approach poetry. Now, we will go over some ways to draw from life at the end of the video, but for now we're going to move on to talk about our next device, symbolism. Simply put, symbolism is when a material symbol is used to represent an abstract idea or concept. A symbol can be anything material, from an object, image, person, time, place, or event, and the abstract that it represents is without physical form, and therefore can be anything non-material, as in only limited by our imagination. So a symbol is able to work and denote meaning for something else by reason of relationship, association, convention, or accidental resemblance. So I just want to mention that there is a large amount of archetypal symbols or kind of perennial images that are good to familiarize yourself with when you're writing. So these are images that have an inherent meaning because of our natural associations with them. So certain elements, seasons, animals, colors, there is already an established meaning represented by these certain images that it's inherited to us from our cultural experiences, but also seemingly beyond material experience when you get to the heart of it. So it's just something to be aware of so as not to be too reliant on pre-existing symbols. Obviously, we're going to be using them to some extent, but if we're not careful, we can end up falling into really well-worn territories of thought that have already been explored with those certain images. So how do we create our own symbols? As said before, by reason of relationship, association, convention, and accidental resemblance. And we build these relationships and associations within the context of our poem. In order to accomplish making unique and effective symbols, we need one more tool. Symbols are usually accomplished alongside metaphors that we spend time establishing. So let's go ahead and look at that last device. Now, metaphor is similar to symbolism because they are both used as a tool of representation, but that's about where the overlap ends. To be specific, a metaphor is defined as a figure of speech in which a word or phrase, literally denoting one kind of object or idea, is used in place of another to suggest a likeness or analogy between them. So what does that mean? When trying to write a metaphor, it really does come down to subtext. So this means that for your poem, you have to be operating at two levels. On the first level, we just have the concrete images of the poem that make up the poem. And then on the second level, we have all of the meaning that is created by the inclusion of your imagery. So it's actually the synthesized meaning of what all of your included images are communicating together. So this is what is meant by subtext, and this is made possible by intentional word choice, often referred to as tone. Generally, subtext is the tone of the language you're using when describing imagery, and this is probably one of the trickiest parts of writing poetry. Sometimes we're able to write metaphors on the fly, but that is a very rare kind of accident. Say you're starting from scratch, you don't how do I write a metaphor? You need two things. You need an aim and you need material. So your aim is your theme or idea that you want your poem to address or reflect on. Your material is then the collection of cohesive concrete imagery. So if you know what kind of images you're going to be using, and you know what the theme is that you want your poem to showcase, you will be able to bridge the gap through the use of word choice in order to create that missing subtext. Now, one way to ensure that all of your images are cohesive is to actually restrain your poem to a situational scene. As said before, with poetry, we have the level of the material situational aspect of what the poem is about, but then through the poem's tone, the choice of language, and how we're talking about those images, there is a created subtext of metaphor that reveals the poem's allegory or deeper meaning. Not all poems need to have an allegory, but all poems ought to have some degree of figurative language. They need to have some reason for existing in the first place. So now that we've gone through and discussed these three devices, let's go ahead and move to our next segment. So we're actually going to spend some time and look at examples of imagery, symbolism, and metaphor used in Edgar Allan Poe's poem, A Dream Within a Dream. For this analysis, we're primarily going to focus on the second stanza because that's where a lot of the imagery is happening. To begin, we see some sonic imagery of the roaring shoreline, but it's placed on top of the visual image of an extremely broken up shoreline. Then, there is the tactile sensation of holding grains of sand in his hand. We also even get a visual / kinesthetic image of the sand creeping through his fingers. We then have the organic image of the speaker weeping. So right there, in those few lines, we have 5 different kinds of images being used. So the images in and of themselves are already starting to establish a disturbed mood. So we're starting to see how subtext is being established. As we will soon find, these images and their significance to the reader is expanded by the simultaneous use of both symbolism and metaphor. So let's go ahead and see what symbols are being used. I would say that the 2 main symbols here are the golden sand and the deep. So we know that the gold is an inherent kind of archetypal symbol used to denote something of high value. The deep here, in its context, can then be seen as a physical representation of destruction or loss. Now, as said before, there is a lot more meaning we can actually extract from these symbols if we look at their interplay with metaphor. So let's go ahead and look at that final device. To take a look at the full poem, we see that it actually begins in a figurative way. The first line contains a kiss upon our brow, a kind of blessing to the reader. Additionally, in the first stanza, it shows a kind of abstraction of the speaker with the resolute lines, "You are not wrong, who deem that my days have been a dream." And as readers, we aren't quite sure what is meant by this metaphor. However, later we start to understand, although we simultaneously start to have even more questions. All that we see or seem is but a dream within a dream. So not only are his days a dream, but a dream within a dream. And this phrase is very powerful and denotes the idea that there is falsehood in and of our own perception, as well as our alienation from the world itself. Within the final stanza, we get an allegorical scene, a kind of extended metaphor. The waves are depicted with violence, not only through the sound of a roar, but also with the waves' residual impact on the shoreline. Amidst this chaos, the speaker is desperately holding on to his golden sand as it creeps away from him into the deep. This whole scene is a metaphor. Perhaps it's showcasing the passage of time, or maybe it's an account of precious memories fading. Regardless of what the golden sand represents, the fate for the golden sand is the same. The deep, the end of all possession, death. The existential cry is made clear when the speaker calls out to God and asks what are truly the limits of the speaker's being. And so the poem ends with a metaphysical acknowledgement of helplessness against the passage of time, how we lose what is most precious to us regardless of how we struggle. The poem concludes in a question to show the desperate and unsure nature of the speaker. This adds to the unease of the poem and demands for the reader to consider the speaker's question regarding the nature of our own perceptions. So the reason I picked this particular poem was because of the strength of its imagery in the second stanza. After examining this poem in the layers of image, symbol, and metaphor, I hope that it's become clear just how these devices can work. These components are not only built on top of each other to create meaning, but are actually intertwined with one another to compound the meaning of the overall poem. So each part is independent and yet somehow are also interrelated. Now, as a side note, I want to say that this kind of textual analysis can be helpful in showing us what is possible within the medium of poetry, but it should not be used as a template for our own writing. It's alright to be inspired by other artists, but we shouldn't try to blatantly imitate their work. An unchecked influence can ruthlessly make our own work derivative. When we rely too heavily on the ideas or perspectives of others when crafting our own art, it creates a kind of uncanny artifice that can be spotted as inauthentic. Just as we can easily recognize when a student artist renders a portrait from a photograph as opposed to life. Our decisions need to be rooted in our own senses, experiences, anxieties, and hopes. That is the guiding force that informs us on what choices to make with imagery, symbolism, and metaphor in our writing. So if we want to write better symbols and metaphors, we need to work on cultivating our own images. One way we can do this is by the consistent practice of taking even the most mundane details of life and figuring out ways to make them novel to us once again. We do this by being mindful and aware of our senses day to day, by taking the time and space to actually notice our surroundings. This can be achieved with something as simple as arriving 15 minutes early to an appointment or errand so that you actually have time to look around and think, or taking the time to write down a striking bit of conversation you overheard or behavior that you witnessed when you were at work or the grocery store. It could be recording your dreams, regardless of how abstract or absurd they may seem in their entirety. If you want to do something more committed, you could take a few hours and go downtown or to a particular landscape like a forest or field, seaside, and practice writing not only what you see, but what you feel. And through this practice of actually opening ourselves up to observe, we can really be struck by the details that stand out to us. Sometimes we look at images and we instinctively know how they can be used in order to enliven certain dimensions of our poetry. Other times it may be a mystery, and it may not be readily apparent what the meaning of the images actually serve in a given depiction. But you don't need to know in the moment. You just need to write it down and collect these images. Later you can look back over them, and when you do reflect on these kind of writing sketches, you may find the answer to why an object in a scene stood out to you. And eventually you may even be able to finally be aware of what symbols and metaphors have been hiding amongst these images that you've recorded. Aside from keeping a catalog of your external reflections, you can also have a dedicated place to keep track of your own internal tools of reference. Everyone's familiar with the phrase, "A wise man knows what he does not know." As artists, we can apply this to our work by actually taking the time to seek out ways to further our own understanding of what we actually perceive in our day-to-day life. We do this by taking the time to find nuance in how we describe our surroundings. Being able to identify things like plants, trees, clouds, architecture, vehicles, colors, sounds, and so much more can really evolve the kind of precision of a poetic voice. And this actually brings a refined clarity to our choices when we realize just how many options we actually have. So after going through all of that information, I think that the best way to end this video is to actually go through the process of a poetry sketch and making it into a poem. So here I have a poetry sketch from the laundromat that I made the other day. I decided to choose a laundromat to show that you can literally do this from anywhere. Autumn after dusk, swift cool breath of air at the laundromat, coughing fit, a man walks slumped in a dark hoodie under an artificial glowing dome of a parking lot street light, a white, dirty, dusted van, destination tires are 4 fat, faded pillows, giant cookie bites of rust on the doors, dusted hand marks, pools of oil stains, hazy dark sky darkening. Hazy blue sky darkening. With these images, I'm already starting to get the theme of time, with the season, the ending of the day, the dust, as well as the rust. The white van itself was actually the inspiration for me to even decide to do this portion of the video. I just found it striking. I think my favorite image was the artificial glowing dome, just because of the way that the light was from the end of the day. There was just that light glow of the day lingering, and then the artificial lights at the building, like outside the building. So of course these images are fragmented, but for me, when I read each image, I'm actually remembering what I saw in that moment, and so there's a strength of writing down these details because I can actually think back and then draw from it when I'm writing. So then here is the written poem. Again, the shallow evening glow at the laundromat, the swift cool breath of autumn's air, and the coughing fit out from a nearby van, white but dusted. Its tires are like flattened rings fading into the dark pools of the old oil stains below. Its underside has 2 giant cosmic bites of rust. Doors are marked with endless handprints. As an unseen door slams, the man emerges. He walks slumped in a dark hoodie, slow and sick with heaviness. He passes through the artificial glowing dome of the parking lot street lamp under that hazy blue darkening sky. So obviously, this is the first draft. So my thoughts were, when I was going to develop the poem, was to go in the direction of paying more attention to the actual environment of the laundromat itself. The fact that doing a load of laundry is called a cycle, the fact that we kind of cycle our lives around doing laundry, the act of waiting in a kind of liminal space, all of these I thought were ideas that I could potentially evolve in order to kind of synthesize some kind of metaphor, deeper commentary. But then I also thought, like, maybe I won't go into any of that because maybe the laundromat is a symbol in and of itself. So for the sake of the demonstration, I actually went a step further and I did a second draft of the poem. And this is that draft. In the sure cycle of this found season, again I am met with the shallow night's glow. Within the soft perpetual beat of a lifted dome's artifice, that true and earnest attempt at wellness, though frail and crude to the eye, it is the best chance of light to hope for while I'm here. Parked outside my usual laundromat, sat patiently in my quiet alterations between my books and journal and that dark brick wall I catch with each warm coffee sip. Week after week returning to this waiting, to this stark awareness of my compression. My window is cracked open like a yawn. It gives a swift, cool breath of autumn air that passes in a staggered measure, but then a sharp staccato sounds, a sudden desperate coughing fit. In revolving impulse, I look up from my book to see a van. Its tires are like half-flattened rings suspended upon the aged cement's dark oil stains. Its underneath has 2 giant cosmic bites of rust, and though marked by an endless faded impression of stone-turned hands, its white coat endures. As the unseen driver door slams, a man emerges. He walks slumped in a dark hoodie, slow and sick with heaviness. He passes through all by the lamplight of the parking lot, under that hazy blue darkening sky. Soon my gaze returns to my lap, to each soft loop of my waiting's continuance. So this is the second draft, and I would say that there are finally some metaphors that are really starting to come through and take form. So during the editing process for this version of the poem, I started to incorporate some language that was indicative of repetition, to sort of give a nod at how our daily life has a certain rhythm to it. I also wanted to involve more of the speaker's perspective into the poem to actually give it more of a kind of intimate feel and to try and give more relevance to the meaning of the scene itself. For the form, I tried to stick with line lengths that are about 10 syllables each. Since this is meant to be a more kind of introspective kind of reflection on time, it felt appropriate to have longer lines. The end is a little weak, but it at least cohesively kind of concludes the poem. I somehow want to incorporate more metaphors in the kind of spirit of the line. Its underside has 2 giant cosmic bites of rust. Just the idea of further personifying the passage of time in this vein of kind of an external entity is just something that seems really interesting to me. So in conclusion, thank you so much for being here. I hope that the video was helpful for you in some way. I hope that you learned something, or that you got some ideas on how to approach your own writing in the dimensions of imagery, symbolism, and metaphor. Obviously, there are things that I might have missed or may not have been able to touch on in this video. If you have any questions about anything that I mentioned today in this video, feel free to let me know. And that's it.